You're listening to JaysAnalysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at JaysAnalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer. To Jay's Analysis. If you heard a few weeks ago, I had another priest on, and that was Father Chris Moody, and we talked about the theology of St. Gregory of Palamas and the debates that he had with Latin theologians, and that got really deep, and we had a good reaction to that podcast. And today we're going to talk about similar topics, but maybe in a different vein. We're going to be talking to Father Peter Heers, who was born in Texas and grew up near San Francisco. He is the son of an Anglican priest, and in 1992 his parents and much of his father's parish converted to the Orthodox Church. In 1996 he moved to Thessaloniki, Greece, in order to study or to visit Mount Athos, returning again in 1998 to begin the theological school of the University of Thessaloniki. He has lived in Thessaloniki for the past 18 years, where he was married to a Thessaloniki native and is blessed with 5 children. Father Peter, in addition to being the founder and current head of Uncut Mountain Press, was also the founder of the first editor of Divine Ascent, a journal of the Orthodox faith, which I've read many issues of that. It's very, very, very good. He is also the host of an online podcast, Postcards from Greece, found at Ancient Faith Radio. He's also a regular speaker at parish groups in the U.S. and Canada. He's author of Missionary Origins of Modern Ecumenism, Milestones Leading up to 1920, and a newly released title, The Ecclesiological Renovation of the Second Vatican Council, an Orthodox examination of Rome's ecumenical theology regarding baptism in the Church, which is due out in November of 2015. I think it is out. I've been reading the copy that Father Peter sent me. It's very, very precise. It's phenomenal theological work. I've been very impressed. He's also the translator of several books, including the Life of Elder Paisios and the Epistles of Elder Paisios, The Truth of Our Faith, Volumes 1 and 2, by Elder Cleopa and Apostle to Zaire, the Life of Father Cosmas of Grigoriou. Father Peter, how are you?
Thanks be to God, Jay. It's good to be with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I should add, too, you have a doctorate in dogmatic theology. I missed that little paragraph there. From the University of Thessaloniki. You studied your undergraduate and master's in dogmatic theology as well. So I love theology, and I love talking to theologians and learned and sage wisdom possessed by men such as yourselves. So this book, I got to about a third of the way into this book so far, and I'm really loving it. It really resonates with me as somebody who, just briefly, I spent most of my 20s in Roman Catholicism, and a large part of that in the Society of St. Pius X in opposition to the reforms of Vatican II. So I'm very familiar with Rome's engine of ecumenism and their goals and their intents and the theologians involved. So I think we're going to have a great discussion. And I'm sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to point out why it's relevant, I think, to have you on. So what led you to write this book?
Well, first of all, Jay, I'm thrilled to be with you as well, because I'm just eager to engage with the Roman Catholic or former Roman Catholic world and to discuss these issues, because it's been something that I've been working on for so long, so many years now. What led me to this book? Well, most converts to the Orthodox faith, as myself and others in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe, we're immediately confronted with the issue of how we're going to be received into the church. And so from the beginning of my time in the Orthodox Church, this issue of reception, either by chrismation or by baptism, was an issue. And that's, of course, an issue of ecclesiology. It's an issue of where the boundaries of the church are. And being someone who passed through Catholicism on the way to Orthodoxy, I was an Anglican. I was raised an Anglican. My father was an Anglican priest for 28 years before his whole parish, most of his parish, became Orthodox. But I was away at the university, and I was attending I was attending the Roman Catholic Church for about 2 years as basically a catechumen. Never became Roman Catholic formally, but I was on my way there when my parents became Orthodox. So I've been drawn to issues surrounding the differences between Catholicism and Orthodoxy from the very beginning of my times in Orthodox Christian.
Oh, okay. Well, so we've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah. So these issues just naturally came together. On the one hand, I'm looking at the question of ecclesiology. I'm looking at the question of baptism and where it is and what it is and how and what are the presuppositions for the mysteries. And then in my master's degree, I was looking at St. Basil the Great on his canons on heretics and schismatics and the reception of them into the church. And then because Vatican II is such a major event in the last 50 years and has affected so much of the ecumenical movement, it just seemed it naturally came together that I would look at what Vatican II had to say about baptism and ecclesiology. And it's been very helpful because what we're doing right now in the church, right now, literally these 3 or 4 months ahead of us, we're looking at what the Pan-Orthodox Synod is going to be discussing, and a lot of what my book talks about is coming to head within Orthodoxy. So Vatican II and the repercussions in terms of its ecclesiology are not limited to Catholicism today. It's affected a lot of the Christian world outside of Catholicism. So they're all connected. A lot of these issues are connected. Baptism, ecclesiology, Orthodoxy, Catholicism. It's all connected and very much a part of the life of the church today. We've got to deal with these issues as Orthodox theologians and know what the Orthodox fathers of the church say and teach.
Well, let's talk about Blessed Augustine. When I was 21, I was attending a Baptist Bible college and then did some time at a Calvinist seminary. And I remember I thought, well, we all here like Augustine, so I'm going to read some of his stuff. So I went and bought City of God, and I read all the way through City of God. And then I thought, well, this guy does not sound like a Baptist or a Calvinist. He sounds like some kind of Catholic guy. So that put me on a long journey of beginning to read in depth into the Latin Church Fathers at that time. Since then, of course, I branched out into Eastern Fathers. But as I delved more and more into Augustine, that's what took me in the journey of Catholicism. But what I started noticing as I entered the Catholic world, originally into just the normal Novus Ordo Missae parish, I started noticing all these wild liturgical innovations with clown masses and rock bands and all this. And so there's kind of a natural progression where you're trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And then you learn about, the Second Vatican Council, and you find out that there were all these movements. So let's talk about maybe Augustine a little bit, because he was so formative in my past. I took his name in baptism, actually, and chrismation. So he's got a strange view of the sacraments. And if we talk about Roman Catholic sacramentology, we really have to begin with Augustine as, I think, the most foundational, formative first figure. I mean, certainly other, Latin fathers talked about sacraments, but he's really formative because the position that he formulates on ex opere operato, that is, that the sacraments work by the working of the word themselves, and that they are valid even outside the church, would become formative and dogmatic for the Roman Catholic tradition.
Yes.
How do you see it? How do you see it? Because in your book, you start talking about him, and so how is it that this is relevant to what's going on with Vatican II?
Well, I mean, Augustine is the father of sacramental theology for the West. He's the one that is quoted most often by Aquinas in his treatise on the sacraments. And so, even though I make the case in 2 chapters here, one main chapter, that Aquinas departs from Augustine on really the most key part of the puzzle of what happened in the West in its evolution of considering heretical or schismatic baptism. But there's no question you have to understand and start with Augustine to understand than what the differences are post schism. And so Augustine was attempting to remain within the patristic consensus. I think he really was, and I think in some ways he did. And the most important part of that is that he does, no matter how innovative he became, and there are scholars who say that he pretty much created a whole new theology of the church, and they even called him the first modern man. I mean, they see him as blazing his own trail in terms of sacramental theology. In spite of that, he does come back to the one of the most important cornerstones in terms of the boundaries of the church and the heretics and schismatics and their relation to the church, and that is that the Holy Spirit does not operate salvifically in the mysteries of the schismatics or heretics. Valid, yes, and when he means valid, when he talks about the sign, the sacrament being there, it can be there, it is there, and it doesn't need to be repeated when they come back to the church. But unless they're in the unity of the church, the grace of God is not working, it's not saving, and there is no salvation. And that was a cornerstone for all the previous fathers before him, Cyprian, of course, but also Irenaeus and Ignatius. I think you can make the case. St. Ignatius certainly did not see those who departed from the Eucharistic synaxy as maintaining the grace of God. And this is the key. This is the key today, because Vatican II has abandoned this. And with it, most of contemporary ecumenism and a lot of the Orthodox ecumenists, they don't see that as these boundaries. And unfortunately, there's a lot of disingenuous scholarship in terms of people talk about returning to Augustine, and with Vatican II, they're not returning to Augustine, and because that Augustine maintained that, and he kept that teaching from the previous fathers, and that's not happening today. So what I say in my book is that Augustine laid the groundwork or the foundation for further innovation, which he didn't go all the way where Aquinas would go, and Aquinas did the same thing, and then it came Congar and Vatican II and took it further. So it's step by step. You have a distancing from the patristic consensus and the fullness, and unfortunately, Augustine is the beginning of that in the West. His innovativeness, because methodologically, he doesn't seem to me to be following the fathers before him. He seems to be a creative theologian and creates a lot of things that nobody else ever even imagined in terms of his conceptions of what's happening in those mysteries. I do think he was trying to do it for the sake of the return of the schismatics. I think there was a pastoral element, and that's very patristic. The fathers, when they did talk about these issues, it was always in the context of the pastoral working out of salvation for the world. They weren't academic theologians, but he did cross the boundaries and fill the need. There was no sense of economia that we have in the Orthodox Church in Augustine. I mean, he wanted to connect it and make it all make sense with ecclesiology logically, or like a system. Whereas in the East and St. Basil, and people don't get St. Basil because he doesn't do that. And people even say he's inconsistent. There are scholars today, even Callistus Ware, who supposes that he's somehow just being inconsistent. But if you understand what economia, and that's we can talk about that later because it's really important to understand the whole concept of akrivia and economia, or exactitude, and it doesn't really translate. Management of the household would be a very poor, phrase basically to explain economia in the Orthodox Church, but that doesn't exist in the West, and so there's this need to have everything connect, and so along with this new sacramental theology is really the beginning of a new ecclesiology. So I don't know if I answered your question. But
no, it's great because the one of the things you pointed out early on in the book is the notion of sort of with a scalpel kind of dividing the parts of the rites up into individual things in terms of, well, this is the necessary aspect of it, and the rest of this is the, adiaphora, or not necessarily necessary, or, whatever. And that begins in Augustine, and you really see that flourish or come to its full fruition in the Summa, where, Aquinas has extensive Q&As on every one of the sacraments in the Latin tradition, and it's all completely divided up in, like I said, with scalpel-like precision. And that is an exemplification of the problem, because the problem, as you pointed out, is that these rites were never intended to be sliced up and put into a kind of, XML spreadsheet or something where you could list these things. They're all part of a liturgical celebration, right?
Well, and that eventually ends up post-schism. In practice, you have a division of the mysteries, and so you have a disintegration, essentially, of the unity of the mysteries post-schism in the West, right. And that's huge. That's really key. You cannot create the kind of ecclesiology that's been created in Vatican II without that happening. You cannot create the kind of ecclesiology that happens in Vatican II and in ecumenism today without there being experientially a disintegration of the unity of the mysteries, so that people are thinking that baptism alone is initiation into the church. And that can't happen unless you're doing the kind of theology you're talking about.
Exactly.
You're losing sense of experientially of the unity of the mysteries, and you're approaching it like an academic theologian, just kind of slicing it up and examining it. And the minute you do that, it's dead. It's dead on arrival. It's not. We don't do that in the church. It's just not. It's not going to happen. So it's amazing how it's all connected, and it leads to where we are today. And that was one of the most fascinating aspects of my research. Was I really felt like there was a development of doctrine, and it should probably be called a dissolution of doctrine, and not a development. And so you arrive today with this very minimalistic approach to the mysteries and to the ecclesiology.
Exactly, the minimalism. That's exactly what the issue is. And one of the things that I noticed too was that when I've read, say, Father John Romanides, or even Dr. Philip Sherrard, different theologians who have critiqued the Western perspective on the Trinity and the Incarnation and the divine energies, there's a lot of critiques that deal with that, and people will sort of locate the problems of the West in that period, and I don't think that's incorrect. But what I think you've pointed out is that it also goes back to Augustine, and it's the nature of the church itself that's the problem in the West, because the theology that you have is going to kind of work itself out into how you view the church. And so, in other words, we can see with the doctrine of I would say the doctrine of the papacy and the doctrine of the church in the West is a reflection of these erroneous views. And you're absolutely right that they lead, I think, to dissolution. And that's what we see in the Second Vatican Council's results. Drastic declines in everything from monasticism to the priesthood, to the universities, to church attendance, to baptisms in the Latin Church. All of that is really imploded. Benedict XVI just came out of his retirement the other day to make a comment that, the church is in crisis. And I'm thinking,
yes, yeah, I saw that yesterday.
Have you not known? I mean, you were there, right? At Vatican I, you were wearing a suit and tie. I mean, at Vatican II. He was one of the Parizzi at Vatican II, and
right.
So,
now he just realized that. I mean,
yeah.
So it's been going on for 50 years, and he's been a part of it.
So
this whole dissolution.
Just to play devil's advocate, and I don't actually believe this, but what would you say if a traditional Catholic, someone who's very interested in Thomism, and I do have quite a few readers and listeners at JaysAnalysis who are Roman Catholic, and they are big fans of Thomas Aquinas and Augustine. If playing devil's advocate, they said, well, look, man, part of the reason Augustine's doing this is because he's trying to say, hey, if we go the route of saying that, baptism is only working in the church, then you're going to leave people in a position of doubting whether the priest is Orthodox or not. You see what I'm saying? In other words, the layman's going to be wondering, well, how do I know this guy, has all the right theology and that the Holy Spirit's actually working in this local setting, and maybe this guy's a heretic. That's the kind of argument, that Augustine levels in on baptism against the Donatists.
Well, in my reading, and this gets kind of complicated, but I think Augustine, I think at least the scholars examining Augustine and Cyprian, Saint Cyprian, they don't see Cyprian in the Catholic fullness and understand what he's doing. So they're I don't know how much Augustine does, but they're maybe seeing Cyprian as somehow aiding and abetting the Donatists in their view of this the need to be morally pure in order for the mysteries to work, and that's what he's fighting against. Augustine's fighting against, but Cyprian was, at least the Orthodox tradition is certainly not doing that, and the focus there is not on the minister, but on the unity of the church, and the church, and Christ, who is the church, he's the head and the body, is the one who is baptizing, and he's the one that's given and is giving in the mysteries, and so this is what is the criteria for understanding where the mysteries are. The fullness. There's not the many, because we've done X, Y, and Z. There's water. There's the names. There's mystery. The Father's never looked at it like that. It can never be
Right.
boiled down to that kind of thing. It's all of it. It's all together.
A totality package, right?
Yes, it's an organic unity. Has to be there. There has to be Orthodox faith. There has to be the unity of the church. All of it has to be there. They can't just be. So the answer to this idea of the very idea of validity of mysteries is doesn't exist in the canons of the church. Doesn't exist in the writings of the Eastern Fathers. It's a legalistic approach to the whole. The mysteries are authentic when they're all connected, and they're all part of the unity of the church, and they're within the life of the church. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but the problem with that approach that you talked about is this boiling down to try to take it out of the Donatist paradigm. Both of them are wrong. The Donatist paradigm is wrong, but also the answer given to try to overcome the Donatist paradigm and the focus on the person of the priest being pure or clean or true or whatever. There could have been a much better answer given than was given theologically, and we didn't need to create a whole new theology in order to overcome the Donatist paradigm. And so I don't know if that answers the question, but the answer is in St. Basil's approach to the whole thing. We can talk about that. I think it's the cure of the sickness that happened in the West.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I would like to hear that. It also makes me think of, there's a letter of Athanasius. I was looking through my books here, where he discusses this in relationship to apostolic succession. And it's kind of the same idea, which I noticed, having read a bunch of Augustine, when I read that in Athanasius, I was like, well, that's completely the opposite of Augustine's, position, because, holy orders would be valid, even if the person was heretical. Which again, it gets to the point of absurdity. And then when you read Athanasius talking about apostolic succession, he says, well, no, it's just simply not valid outside the church. How can an unholy person transmit the office of the keys, a heretic or somebody wicked, right? Because in Roman Catholicism, a person can be a Satanist and still have valid apostolic succession.
Well, apostolic succession for the Orthodox doesn't exist unless there's Orthodox faith.
Right. That's what Athanasius said.
The historical continuation in and of itself is not enough. And I've got a little subchapter on that, the whole criterion of recognition of mysteries in my book, where I examine that. And there's all kinds of contradictions in contemporary Roman Catholic understanding on that point. So on the one hand, they recognize the mystery, the baptism from Protestants, but at the same time they say the Protestants don't have a priesthood. Mm-hmm. And why would on the one hand they not be able to do the mystery of baptism, but not be able to do the mystery of the Eucharist? Both of them. And there's
Hello.
What's happening in the Orthodox Church today?
Could you repeat that? You cut out there for the last few sentences. Could you repeat that?
I said we should get into Vatican II ecclesiology, and it will help us understand the dead end of some of these approaches. And it'll also help us understand the problems in the Orthodox Church, because some of these same fallacies are being promoted by Orthodox theologians today, and we have a problem within the Orthodox Church, because we're adopting some of these Vatican II ideas in terms of ecclesiology, and it's creating a lot of problems.
I noticed in one of the reviews, or actually the description of your book, it says the roots of the new ecclesiology in the recent and distant West, and that would include Cardinal Bay, Yves Congar, Cardinal Newman, as well as Calvin, Augustine, Aquinas, etc., are unearthed and examined in the book, thus shedding new light on the continuity or discontinuity of Vatican II with the Western tradition. So when we move forward to Vatican II, of course, John the 23rd calls for this in the early 60s, and this Vatican II begins in October of 1962, closing under Paul VI in 1965, and what we have is what John the 23rd called the aggiornamento, or the new springtime, mm-hmm. supposed to breathe new life into both lungs of the church, so to speak, East and West. And so mm-hmm. A lot of different opinions on Vatican II, but I think that you are correct in what you've written in the book about what the goal of Vatican II actually was. So we're going to look at some of the theologians and the new liturgical movement and so forth, and how that influenced this Augustinian idea to really come to what I think is kind of a dissolution of Roman Catholicism. I see it kind of as the end. I mean, I know that it's intended to subsume both Rome and the Anglican Orthodoxy and the Anglican world, as well as aspects of Protestantism, to try to bring everybody back under the fold, so to speak. But really, it looks like it's the self-destruction of the Latin tradition.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's a new Reformation. It's a new Reformation, but it's a Reformation instead of going counter to the Reformation. It's going toward the Reformation, and it's an embrace of some of the principles of Reformation. I think it was one of the most fascinating parts of my research is that the idea of the key element of the Second Vatican II ecclesiology, really the foundation, is the creative adaptation by Yves Congar of an idea first put forward by Calvin, mm-hmm. and now exactly where Calvin got it, I think probably it was also a creative adaptation of Augustine. I'm not sure, but he cites Calvin, and the scholars who cite him say that he cites Calvin for the idea of vestige ecclesiae, and then Calvin looks at that in a negative light. He sees that he talks about Rome having the vestiges of the church, but not being a church. Whereas he turns it around and says it's positive. He says, look, well, there are vestiges of the church in Protestantism, and this is a positive thing. And then he builds essentially the Second Vatican Council ecclesiology on this. So he says, first of all, there are elements of the church outside of Catholicism. Mainly baptism is what he has in mind. It's the basis, because that's where everything starts. And he says, well, if they have baptism, then they're being initiated into the church. Well, they can't be initiated into anything else. It has to be into the church. And so we have the beginning of the church, and eventually they arrive at the point where they talk about an ecclesial nature. and the nature of a church existing, although it's not the church. And so they step by step, he's the main, Congar is the main visionary here, but other theologians are working on the same thing during the 50s and 60s. And so on the eve of Vatican II, he says we've reached a consensus on a differentiated participation in the life of the church for the no longer schismatics or heretics, the separated brethren. Another key change in perspective, because they're looking at things positively now, and they're talking about it in a positive nature. They throw away the historic categories from St. Basil, which is that there's the church, and then there's schisms, heresy, and parasynagogy, which would be legal assemblies, essentially. Those categories are gone. They're no longer discussed anywhere post-Vatican II, and in fact, that's the case among Orthodox as well. In the ecumenist camp of Orthodoxy, no one talks about schismatics or heretics anymore.
Right.
They're separated brethren, or they're other Christians, or they're other churches. And so this all began with, I think it really began in earnest with Congar and his creative adaptation of Calvin, and this idea that the elements are there, so somehow the church is there. So then that definitely contributed to the change, the famous change at Vatican II, which was we're no longer going to talk about the Roman Catholic Church or the Church of Rome being the church.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about it subsisting.
Yes.
The church subsists in the Catholic Church. It's no longer, it's not est, the church is. And that is explained by the very committee, the dogmatic committee of the council. It's explained as reflecting our new understanding of the non-Roman Catholics. So it's absolutely connected. I mean, people who say that this change doesn't really change anything. I know that this Pope Benedict, when he was still head of the Congregation of Faith, he said, no, this is no essential change. We're just continuing what we had before. That's nonsense. It says right there in the council that our changed perception of what the separated brethren are changes. That's why we're making this change in our understanding, our self-understanding. They're all connected. You cannot, the minute you change your understanding of the schismatics or heretics, you're going to change the understanding of the church. They're connected. It goes back to, I think Congar is the key. If you don't understand what he's doing there in the 30s in divided Christendom, you're not going to understand Vatican II, and then you're not going to understand the challenges even within Orthodoxy today. You're not going to understand what's going on, and a lot of people don't. I mean, the Orthodox theologians in the East, in Georgia, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece, they don't read these texts.
Right.
They don't know anything about what's happening in the West. They don't understand this whole development that's happening in the West. And so this language of ecumenism that's being used among Orthodox ecumenists in the West is just they don't understand it. They don't have the interpretive key to make sense of it. So they hear, certain words, they interpret it maybe even in an Orthodox manner on our end, but it's not being used that way. And so it's really important for us to understand where these ideas come from. And that's what my goal was with the book,
right.
Was not just to say, look, this is what they teach at Vatican II, but where does it come from? Where do they get these ideas? What are the origins of these ideas? And once we do that, then it changes their whole, it opens up horizons for us. And I think there's still a lot of work to do. My book is not the end at all. It's at the beginning. There's a lot of work we can do to understand the roots of this new ecclesiology that's come out of Vatican II. And it'll help tremendously our own understanding of Orthodoxy and our own Orthodox ecclesiology.
Well, one of the things I always point out, and this is something that struck me when I was Roman Catholic and sort of gradually making my way out of that communion, was the fact that you have the encyclical from Pius XI called Mortalium Animos, and that was right around, I think, 1928. And it's right in that period that you're talking about with these nouveau theologians proposing these creative ideas. And in that document, Pius XI explicitly says that the participation on the part of Catholics in the ecumenical movement and its various manifestations is absolutely forbidden, and it constitutes apostasy. Now, what a lot of Roman Catholics don't understand is that in Roman Catholic theology, you have what's called extraordinary magisterium, which would be things like ex cathedra statements, right? Or the teachings from an ecumenical council. But you also have what's called ordinary magisterium, and that is also believed to be protected by the Petrine charism according to Vatican I. And I'm getting a little technical here, but there's a reason for this. So what a lot of Roman Catholics will do is say, well, we don't have to listen to Mortalium Animos anymore because we have Vatican II and Unitatis Redintegratio, which is the decree on ecumenism, and that sort of superseded that. But what's curious and contradictory from a Roman Catholic standpoint is that, no, you can't do that. You can't have an ordinary magisterial teaching like Mortalium Animos and a whole host of other papal decrees and apostolic letters and so forth that deal with the topic of ecumenism being explicitly condemned and forbidden. And then suddenly in the 50s and 60s, all of that's reversed. That's just an outright, complete, total contradiction. And that was one of the things that really stuck out to me, because I, as a Catholic, a traditionalist, I read a whole bunch of those pre-Vatican II encyclicals. And there's the most obvious night and day approach. And the root of it is what you're getting at. You're hitting at you're right on the pulse of what the root of the problem is. And it's a complete change not that the Roman Catholic theology prior to Vatican II was correct, but what I'm saying is that the change in this matter demonstrates the contradiction of the teaching.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. I think that if you, now this is one of the, when I defended my thesis, this book is essentially my thesis. Very little changed after my thesis. One of the professors just could not get his head around the idea that actually pre-Vatican II ecclesiology is closer to orthodoxy than post-Vatican II. Nobody believes that today in orthodoxy. But I think that in the essentials it is, because they believed in a visible, identifiable body of Christ on this earth, a continuation of the incarnation, essentially, and that's orthodoxy. That orthodoxy is incarnational theology. This idea that where they start talking about, they get away from the scandal of the particular, and they get into this fuzzy spiritual, the Holy Spirit working throughout creation, and therefore the church is throughout creation. All this, I mean, I think we should talk about it. It's really important for some of the Orthodox ideas floating around in Orthodoxy today about where the church is and where it's not, and where it ends. But essentially, pre-Vatican II, they still held on to this old Augustinian view, which, as I said earlier, in its essentials was the ancient church view. I mean, even Metropolitan John Zizioulas, who is an arch-ecumenist and the leader in terms of Orthodox engagement with Rome, and his theology is very problematic in terms of his ecclesiology. He in his major thesis that is celebrated this day, his doctrinal, he says that the consensus in the 3rd century was, even Pope Stephen and Saint Cyprian believed the Holy Spirit is not working in the mysteries outside the church. It doesn't exist. That's the consensus of the ancient church. And he says that in his thesis. That's also what Augustine was talking about. That's what pre-Vatican II ecclesiology was holding on to. Now, that's all rejected at Vatican II, essentially, and I've pinpointed the difference is in Aquinas and his understanding of what's happening in the ministrations of the heretics or the schismatics, and that's really I hope that that's the case. I cannot be for sure, because I'm sure there's tons of scholarship out there that I didn't see and that I should research, but and I hope other people follow up on it, but I think the big change came with Aquinas and his departure from that, from the Augustinian principle that outside the unity of the church, and for that reason, because they're not in the unity of the church, that's why the Holy Spirit is not working in the mysteries. Where he says, Aquinas says, it's the ignorance. If they're ignorant and they're not following the schismatics intentionally, as in rebellion to the church, then the mysteries of the schismatics are efficacious for them. So that's very different. That's a very different understanding of why that's the case. So that the reasons given for what's happening, and then what happens at Vatican II is that schismatics and the heretics disappear, and now they're separated brethren, and therefore no one is at fault anymore for being in schism, and therefore the mysteries are efficacious, and therefore, and the reason just goes on, and the church becomes essentially anywhere there's anybody calling on the name of the Holy Trinity.
It's relativized. Yeah, it's relativized.
The church is there. The minimalized, and so the least common denominator of the church is there. And there's different theories that have been worked out since Vatican II to explain that. But the key goes. I think the key is going back to Aquinas and his departure and the reasons he gives for why and when and for what reason the grace is not working in non-Roman Catholic or non-Catholic sacraments. And so what you're talking about is absolutely the case. That old pre-Vatican II approach to ecumenism was more consistent and closer to the ancient church, which believed in the identifiable body of Christ on earth. Christ walked on earth, and the church is on earth and identifiable. Now you can't say that anymore in post-Vatican II. The church it's identifiable only in the sense that there's somebody saying, calling on the name of the Trinity and using water, but all the marks of the church are no longer there as they were pre-Vatican II.
Yeah, right. Well, it turned into the language of fullness and partial communion, which is new.
Yes.
And you're absolutely right to connect that to Calvin. I attended a Calvinist seminary, so I have all of Calvin's commentaries, and I haven't read all the commentaries, but I've read all of his 1556 Institutes. So I'm very familiar with his sacramentology and his doctrine of the church. And as we were talking before we started the interview, Calvin essentially posits the idea of the visible and invisible church. And so you can find this, for example, in the Westminster Confession, which most Calvinists would adhere to, at least traditional Calvinists. And this idea is that, borrowing from Augustine, you have the notion of the invisible elect, who are the true believers that are predestined, and then you have, of course, the visible group, the visible community of the church, many of whom are not actually elect and will not persevere. Augustine has has a treatise on the gift of perseverance, and so it's really only the elect who will persevere, and then therefore that's how we've got to view the church through that lens. So rather than viewing the church through the lens of incarnation, which is visible, it's viewed through the absurd idea that you can posit this sort of dichotomy between an invisible and a visible, grouping of the church, and that's how then you have a whole bunch of sects within which you could potentially find the elect. Divided into a million Protestant sects and the vestiges within Rome, according to Calvin, right? So you're absolutely right. And I also think that possibly, and even Benedict XVI has a document. I think he wrote. It's either him or the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith put out a document within the last few years about the limbus patrum, and it caused a controversy because Benedict, I think, who signed off on the document, essentially said, well, you don't really have to have the opinion of believing in limbo for infants. Now, the reason that's relevant is because the idea of limbo for infants begins to make its way into the West right around the time of Augustine and afterwards. And the reason for that is because Augustine had a pretty hardline view, as far as I can tell, that unbaptized infants were damned. And so this would play into his ecclesiology because he viewed the necessity of baptism for salvation, such to the extent that it even included any infants that were out there. So if you could, if an infant was on the point of death, well, if you could baptize them really quick, then, that could assure them perhaps of their salvation. So that's another aspect to this, which curiously, Rome apparently has said can be optional now. You don't really have to believe in the limbus patrum of the infants anymore. So there's a change, a change in that too. And I mean, that's not a big issue, but it kind of factors into it.
Yes. I've got a chapter in my book a small chapter on the question of visible and invisible church. And I think it's interesting. Come back again to the idea that the Vatican II essentially is a capitulation to Protestantism, or going toward Protestantism, a reformation of the Catholic Church in the direction of Protestantism, because they have essentially agreed to this idea that the visible and invisible church do not coincide, and
Yes.
on earth, the church militant, if you want to call it that, or the body of Christ on earth no longer coincides, and so. Even Father John Meindorf, in his critique written in the 60s of the Vatican II document, Lumen Gentium, and he says that, he quotes Kolmiakov and says, Romanism was Protestant from the start, I think was the quote. And he says here, how is this much different than what has been talked about in 500 years in Protestantism in terms of ecclesiology?
That's a great point.
So this is not just me. My research is drawing on established Orthodox theologians, and one of the best quotes that I found, and that I think is foundational for me in my research, was Father Alexander Schmemann, actually, and which he's not known as a great ecclesiologist, but actually his views. This is from pre-Vatican II. Mm-hmm. And I want to read it to you just because I think it's key to understand what happened and what's happening in Orthodoxy as well, because we're moving in the same direction. Right. Now, listen, just bear with me for a minute. Let me read this, sure, and then we can comment on it. He says, this is 12 years before Vatican II, and he's talking to Anglicans at the St. Sergius and St. Alban conference. The attitude of the majority of contemporary theologians to the fact of division is very different from the attitude of the Church of the Ecumenical Councils. It may be said that the contemporary theologians, he's talking about Western theologians, the Orthodox theologians in the 50s were not really dealing with this, or less so. The contemporary theologians seek above all to discover the meaning of division and wish paradoxically to determine what might be called the theological status of division. How is division possible? What happens to the sacraments in a church or a community separated from what is supposed to be the true church? What is the validity of their orders? These are the questions raised today. This is the 1950s. It seems to me that all these questions, which a theology, quote unquote, a theology of schism, attempts to answer, are fundamentally connected with the Roman conception of the church as one universal organism and can arise only out of Roman presuppositions. A theology of schism is a product of the desire of theologians to find a place for the church where, according to their own presuppositions, there should be no place for her. But the whole trouble is that, from the Orthodox point of view, these questions are unanswerable because the whole problem is falsely posited and formulated in wrong terms. This may best be proved by the fact that neither the early church nor the church of the period of the ecumenical councils ever raised these questions. And in contemporary Orthodox theology, they are a product of Roman and generally Western influence. I can't stress this enough. A lot of our Orthodox theologians have already fallen into this temptation. They're already working within this paradigm, which is not the paradigm of the ancient church. It's not the paradigm of Orthodoxy. It's clearly a 20th century within the ecumenical movement, and that's what happened. And I think Congar is like the father of this for Catholicism, mm-hmm. and Vatican II is capitulated to this, and so it's what he says is it's falsely posited, it's formulated in wrong terms, it's searching for something which on the basis of ancient church ecclesiology should not be there. And they never asked these questions. They never had to answer them because and that begins with Augustine. I mean, Augustine really began this whole debate. I mean, this whole process of thinking about the church. And now we've come, to fruition in the 20th century with Vatican II and Congar. It was very helpful to me to understand the whole problem, because what happens is you get enclosed into this debate, which from the very beginning it's problematic. It doesn't stand on Orthodox principles, and so it's a dead end. You can't get out. You have to just get out of that and say, no, we're not even going to go that. We're not going to approach it that way. And the Orthodox approach is that we start with the Christology, and the church is essentially. And I think this is really important for Orthodox people to understand that when we talk about the church, we're talking about Christ. And we're talking about Christ throughout the ages. We're talking about the continuation of the incarnation. We're talking about the and if there's any division between Christ and the church, then it's a heresy of Christology and ecclesiology. So we start with that unity. We start with the unity of the mysteries. We start with the context of the church, and then we move out and we try to answer what the pastoral work of the church has been. So many of the people who, in the Orthodox Church anyway, so many of the people who try to answer these questions, like why did we do X, Y, and Z in the 5th century, the 10th century, the 15th century? We have all these different practices, different contradictory practices and pastoral approaches to the heterodox. And they start with those, and then they go back to ecclesiology and try to figure it out. It's not going to happen. And that's what Schmeman's trying to get at here. That is, you're not going to answer it from an Orthodox standpoint. You have to start with, and this means theology by experience, not academic theology.
Amen.
It presupposes that we're experiencing the life of the church, we're living it, and then we go and we try to answer these questions from our own experience of God in the church, and then we look at these outside the church, what's happening, and we answer it. And if we do that, then we don't have these problems. We don't fall into these traps. So anyway, we could go off. There's so many tangents you can get on, but I think that's really an important point to make, at least from an Orthodox standpoint.
Yeah, it makes me think of a couple of points I would add to the quote, and that is that the whole approach of the Latin Church, what dominated my whole approach while I was in that communion was very much that rational scientific approach to these questions, as if they could all be solved, in a systematic, equation type of format that you could just put in the right integers and you'll get the solution to the equation. But that's not really how theology works. In other words, that's all operating on the Western presupposition of how we approach theology. We approach it academically, and then from there we can determine, where the heart's going to go, right? And that's incorrect. Not saying that every Western person in praxis operates that way, but that's the tendency, especially given the fact that, Thomism is the official philosophy of the church, according to Leo XIII. I think it's Pastor Aeternus officially recognizes Thomism as the philosophy of the church. And that relates back to, all these weird ideas that, you can do theology up to a certain point just on natural theology. Aquinas has a whole separate set, the Summa Contra Gentiles, where the first volume he says you can learn everything about God just from reason and looking at creatures, except for the fact that he's three persons. So you can find out that he's a first cause and all this kind of stuff. But you'll never ever figure out that God is personal from this. That has to be learned from the scriptures. Everything else can be learned through reason, though, which I think is kind of ridiculous too. It doesn't really matter. You're not really proving or experiencing who or what God is, right? Or who God is, I should say. And that's why another example of that would be Etienne Gilson, the 20th century medievalist and Thomist, when he's analyzing Exodus, the Ayer, Asher Ayer, where God says, I am that I am, that classically in Thomism and in Latin theology is God saying, I am being. I am Greek philosophical existing being, right? That's not what it is. It's God saying, I am that I am. It's a personal statement, as Father Demetrios Stanilois says in his dogmatic theology. It's a relational statement. It's not a metaphysical, philosophical statement, and that underlies the whole approach of Thomism erroneously. I know I'm rambling, but I just wanted to say that to complement your point that from Father Schmier, that is an illustration of these, and that's why you could have different. Let's bring in voodoo practitioners at CC, right? Because it doesn't just extend to other so-called Christian communions. The results of all this mean, if it's outside the church, then that includes Buddhism, it includes Hinduism, it includes all the religions.
Yes, and One of the interesting little asides here is that in my research was that I ran into a traditional conservative theologian, Journet, Cardinal Journet. I hope I'm saying the name right, French name, and he's considered conservative, and yet his interpretation or building upon Vatican II, from what I gathered from what I read of him, it seemed it's another step into the solution and in the direction that you're going. I mean, he ends up saying essentially anywhere that the Holy Spirit has acted is the beginning of the church, and so there's no distinction of the work of the Holy Spirit in the church and that which is outside the church. Because anywhere that the Holy Spirit has begun to touch a heart and bring him to repentance, the churches exist. And so that's why they can do what you just said. They can talk in the religions of the world, they can find the beginning of the church. But what's missing here is an understanding of the divine energies and the different kinds of energies of God in creation and in the church. And the difference between purification, illumination, deification, which happens only in the church and only in the mysteries and only and begins with baptism. And that is the theosis, the beginning of the path to theosis of man, and the whole point of the church and the point of the incarnation. Whereas the divine energies outside the church, outside the context of the church, there are many divine energies that guide and enlighten and bring people to a greater knowledge of God, but are not yet the church. So there's the Holy Spirit is definitely working outside the church, but what is he doing outside the church? This is something that even Orthodox people confuse and mix up. And there's amazingly there's a consistent misinterpretation of Saint Irenaeus, who says that well, let's see if I can bring it up here, and I don't want to misquote him. Saint Irenaeus says that where the Holy Spirit, where the church is, there is the Spirit of God, and where the Spirit of God is, there is the church. And he's speaking within the context of the church being there where the prophets, apostles, and martyrs are, and he's speaking in fact in the context of the heretics not being a part of this, and yet there are people today who interpret that, take it out of context, and say, well, wherever the Spirit of God is, there's the church. But that's not what Saint Irenaeus is saying. That's not what the Holy Tradition teaches, and that is it's really disingenuous. And there are Christian scholars who are saying this, so there's no discernment of the workings of the Holy Spirit and what he's doing outside and within the church, and this is all a part of the post-Vatican II ecumenical ecclesiology, and how they're trying to extend the church and make in this minimalistic approach to where the church is, and it's really a dissolution of the church at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And this is where we've arrived now, and we can talk about that. I think this is one of the most interesting and really pressing matters, and why my book is let's say contemporary and important for people, is because it's giving us a way to interpret a lot of these new ideas that have come out in the last 20, 30 years and put them in context.
A couple points I would add to from the vantage point of formerly being Roman Catholic, along the lines of the point that I made earlier with Mortalium Animos, is that if you look at Vatican II in light of pre-Vatican II theology and papal pronouncements and bulls and decrees and so forth, a couple other things come to mind that relate to this, one of which is the papal bull of Pius V, and this was at the time of the Reformation, so this is 1570, and there was calls for renovations of the liturgy at that time on the part of the reformers, and this famous bull called for eternal perpetuity of the decree in this bull that the Mass cannot be altered or changed in any significant way. And for Roman Catholicism, the valid sacraments require matter, form, and intention, right? So that would be the matter would be the elements, the form would be the proper words, and then, of course, the intention on the part of the persons involved, be it baptism or the Eucharist or whatever. And in traditional Catholic sacramentology, if any of those are missing or changed, then you have an invalid sacrament. Now, I know that the point of our talk was, of course, to critique the notion of invalid and valid sacraments, period. But it's just interesting that within Roman Catholic theology, you have the notion of, the church sort of being centered around the papacy and the decrees of the papacy, and that extraordinary magisterium and ordinary magisterium. So here we have an example of extraordinary magisterium, a papal decree saying that you can't alter the Mass. And then what does Vatican II? Well, it absolutely alters the Mass, including the words of consecration from for you and for many to for you and for all. So this is a point that the traditionalists, I think, accurately critique in Latin theology. And it just goes to show the extent of the change, as does Leo XIII has a famous decree, Apostolica Curae, about Anglican orders. Right, so the question of the Anglican Church comes to the fore, and are their sacraments valid? Well, Leo says no. The priesthood in Anglicanism is extinguished; it is not there. Therefore, they don't have valid orders, and they must be reordained. So that those are 2 points. And what I'm getting at is that post Vatican II, both of these elements are the Church now has different positions on this. Now, they might technically say that Anglican orders are valid. But what does that matter if the church is subsisting in the Roman Catholic Church, right? It doesn't matter. In other words, all of this is relativized. It doesn't matter.
Right. Yes. It is relativized, and it's intentionally relativized. That's what people have to understand. This is an intentional broadening of the church, and yet it's a church that's full of contradiction. It's a church with different layers and different categories, and that's not unified.
That's another point. Yeah.
It's a church. It's a church with 2 classes of baptized. I mean, how can a baptism exist for an Orthodox? A baptism, as Vatican II accepts, that there are people are baptized in, let's say, some, one of the many thousands of Protestant groups that don't have, that the Roman Catholics do not believe have the Eucharist. And the question is, well, how is someone baptized into the church and yet not able to access the Eucharist? How is that possible?
Yeah. It's the same idea as forbidding infants to receive communion, which Rome innovated in the early Middle Ages.
Well, it's even worse because they don't even recognize the existence of the Eucharist to these people. So they recognize the mystery of baptism to them, and they're saying they're initiated into the church, they're incorporated into Christ according to the decree on ecumenism. Well, what does that mean if they're not communing of the Eucharist? And in the Orthodox theology, it's incomprehensible to even talk about a baptism if there's not immediately a chrismation and communion, not just practically but theologically. So this supposedly more Orthodox ecclesiology that has emerged after Vatican II, which is of course nonsense, is so fractured and it's the dissolution of the church, not a discovery of its deeper unity, so it is a church that, like you were saying, it's just a church. It's a new image of the church, which has very little to do with pre-Vatican II, but it certainly has very much less to do with the patristic vision of the church, which is definitely practically in real life there's unity. It's not theoretically there's a unity, but right now the church is unified. Now they would say, well, Catholicism is the concrete manifestation of the church, and these other groups are in incomplete communion, and they're on the way to full unity, and there's this distinction between full and incomplete unity and all the rest. But they're still a part of the church. And somebody like Francis Sullivan, a scholar from Boston, who's 30 years in Rome and was present during the Second Vatican Council, his vision of. Let me read you his vision. What he says is the new vision of the church. Where have they arrived? And he says, one can think of the universal church as a communion at various levels of fullness, of bodies that are more or less fully churches. It is a real communion, realized at various degrees of density or fullness, of bodies, all of which, though some more fully than others, have a true ecclesial character. So this new church that they're describing, and the Orthodox are part of this new church. We just don't have the Pope. We have these blinders on. We don't realize that the Pope is necessary, more necessary than Christ, actually. So this new vision of the church has more or less fully churches, greater or lesser density of fullness. What kind of church is unheard of? It's so far from the unity that the Orthodox have lived and experienced in the Eucharist. And of course, we as Orthodox, we've always insisted that the boundaries of the church are drawn in blood, not in water. And I use that expression to drive home the point that it's the Eucharist. And in the context of the Eucharist is the unity of the church. And anything outside that is not the unity of the church. So we've never drawn the lines of the boundaries of the church in water. But so we've never recognized that someone could be baptized in a heretical schismatical group and be baptized into the church. That does not happen in Orthodox theology. It didn't happen in pre-Vatican II. I don't think it happened in pre-Vatican II, or at least the Augustinian strain of pre-Vatican II Catholicism. It didn't happen.
Interestingly, Rome's practice in that regard traditionally is to do what they call a conditional baptism. So they don't, they don't say necessarily either way, but they just do conditional to I guess make sure all your papers are in order. Make sure it's valid, I guess.
Yeah, well, but that's probably hearkening back to the Augustinian, strictness. I'm guessing. So there's different strains in Catholicism. There was a time when Augustine was kind of rejected after the Reformation and the rejection of the name just escaped me. The heretical group, the
Jansenists.
Jansenists, right? So they also there was a it was a time when he was kind of put in the freezer. Is that not correct? Where people distanced themselves a little bit from Augustine because of the Jansenist use and abuse of Augustine, and so it seems like to me when I was reading the sources there were different strains and different people warmer or colder to Augustine.
Yeah, a lot of the Jesuits were very opposed to Augustinian ideas, so absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's why you have a variation in ecclesiology and stressing here they're stressing this and elsewhere they're not stressing it at all. But I think that what is common is that even pre-Vatican II they didn't have this kind of this church of many levels and many degrees and different classes of Christians and two kinds of baptism and it's amazing to me that there are Orthodox theologians who actually warm to this and see this as somehow consistent with patristic theology.
That's a good transition there. Let me ask you. So how did this start moving into Orthodoxy? I know that roughly around the time of Vatican II, Patriarch Athenagoras met with Paul VI, and there was this supposed lifting of the anathemas, which actually doesn't mean anything given the fact that nobody really changed their theology. There's just this pretending of the theology not being different. So let's just kumbaya. Let's hold hands and sing songs. How did this really start moving into Orthodoxy?
Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. Put a date on it or anything. But definitely through the ecumenical movement and the ecumenical interactions and the desire for reconciliation with Catholicism and and all the rest. We've been affected by that, and the main theologians who have expressed this kind of ecclesiology are those who are intimately involved in ecumenism and representing the church, mainly the ecumenical patriarchate. But actually, the Russian church also was heavily influenced by Latin post-schism scholastic categories in their understanding of the church. So from this late 17th century,
1700s,
1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, all the way up into the Revolution. Probably, I would say, about the halfway through the 19th century, when there was a beginning of a patristic renaissance in Russia, and you have people coming back to the patristic vision of the church, especially Saint Hilarion Trotsky and Metropolitan Anthony Karpovitsky, and this school of thought, which is following the Kolivadis fathers on Mount Athos and Saint Nicodemus and Saint Makarios and the Athonite patristic renaissance of the 18th century. So that's through Paisios, Velichkovsky, and all the Athonite Philokalia movement that's coming into Russia, and you have the fruit of that is at the end of the 19th century you have a renaissance in patristic thought in terms of the church. I'm talking about ecclesiology, today there are the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church. It seems to me on these crucial points of ecclesiology and the mysteries, the sacramental, they're still trapped in 19th century categories, and they're calling upon certain major figures in the 19th century who were also expressing themselves in this category. And so they've ignored the patristic Renaissance, and just like in Vatican II, the minimalist sacramental theology serves well the ecumenistic agenda. So it's very interesting. I want to come back to the Orthodox, but going back and forth here, it helps us see how one has affected the other. Vatican II, there was at the same time, there was 20th century saw a huge renaissance and return to at least reading the fathers. And so Congar, who I think is an innovationist in terms of ecclesiology, at the same time he was producing and editing and publishing all kinds of texts. So there is, at the same time, this return, and with the return to the fathers, there's a return to sacramental maximalism. But sacramental maximalism does not serve ecumenism well. And so an example of this is Aquinas, for instance, allows for, famously, and the Orthodox have always rejected this, that there's different kinds of, that baptism doesn't mean immersion, it means washing, and therefore you could either baptize by immersion, you can baptize by aspersion, you can baptize by, sprinkling or pouring or whatever, because it's not really about immersion, it's about just washing. And so this minimalistic approach to the mysteries is one example. In the 20th century, there are Orthodox Roman Catholic scholars and Orthodox scholars, obviously, who are saying, no, this minimalistic approach doesn't work. Sacramentalism we've got to reject. And yet, at the same time, the decisions are never made on any kind of conciliar basis level to reject that and go back to sacramental maximalism, because it's the end of ecumenism if we do that. And the same thing is happening in Russian Orthodoxy in some ways. We have reluctance to follow through on the patristic Renaissance on these key issues and key areas of ecumenism, because it would be rejecting the old practice, as still goes on in Russia today, of vesting a Roman Catholic priest who converts to Orthodoxy. I mean, they just had a couple weeks ago in St. Petersburg, they received the Roman Catholic priest by vesting. This reception by vesting is clearly related to an Augustinian concept, and Augustine is the only one in the ancient church who ever imagined that we could receive the heretics back who were in the clergy without chrismation, at least chrismation and reordination. And so in the Greek church, there's never been the idea of vesting. There's never been the idea that somebody could be received in their orders. It's always been the idea that they have to be ordained. In the ancient church, it was a consensus. And so they hang on to these old practices because it became a tradition in Russia, hundreds of years of practicing this, recognizing and thinking in terms of Augustinian categories about the heretics and the schismatics, and they refuse to let the patristic Renaissance kind of flourish. They're still, in terms of ecclesiology, they're still in the Western captivity. I'm talking about the Moscow Patriarchate. The Russian Church abroad, I don't think, is not at all following that line of thinking, and they've returned and they follow people like Saint Hilarion Trotsky. So there's that element of why we smell and look and feel like Vatican II ecclesiology. It's not really because of Vatican II. It's because of categories that we're hanging on to from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries in Russia and other places. But in the Greek context and in the ecumenistic mindset of those who are involved in ecumenism, it seems to me, a 20th century phenomenon. We're directly influenced by our involvement in ecumenism. And so you can have somebody like Metropolitan John Zizioulas say that, and I'll quote it so I don't misquote it. He says that within baptism, even if there's a break, a division, a schism, you can still speak of the church. The Orthodox participate in the ecumenical movement as a movement of baptized Christians who are in a state of division because they cannot express the same faith together. I don't see any real difference between that and the common baptism theory popular in ecumenism and accepted at Vatican II. So this is back in the 1980s, 85. He's saying this in England. So this is something that goes way back, 30 years. He doesn't seem to have changed his views on that. And where does he get this? It's certainly not Orthodox, and it seems to be he's influenced by Vatican II ecclesiology. The representative of the Church of Greece, Metropolitan Chrysostom of Messenia, one of my professors here in the School of Theology, Stylianos Chobanidis, they talk about the recognition, and in fact, in the conciliar text has been accepted, the draft, I should say, that's being proposed to the Pan-Orthodox Council. There's a reference to the ancient canons, and on this basis, we have our dialogue with the non-Orthodox, and it's very interesting that these professors, Chrysostom of Messenia, who's in Greece here, he's a professor of theology, he's also a bishop, he's a representative of the Church of Greece for the Pan-Orthodox Council and for the dialogue with Roman Catholicism. They are claiming that on the basis of this text that's being proposed for the Pan-Orthodox Council, we are actually, although it doesn't state this anywhere in the text, we are actually recognizing katikonomia, by economy, we're recognizing the reality and the validity of heterodox baptism. And in my speech that I'm going to give on Wednesday in Athens at this major conference of the Pan-Orthodox Council, I'm going to examine this phrase and show that that doesn't exist in Orthodox, the fathers and in the canons at all. And it's can be traced back about 40 years, because you asked me where does this come from and how are we connected with this. I think it could be traced the most back 40 years, maybe 60 years, to some canonists here in Greece who were involved in the ecumenical movement.
Yeah, there was, I read some years back a book by Methodios Fouillus, Orthodoxy, yes. Roman Catholicism, and Anglicanism. And
he was heavily influenced by this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, he and others like Livisatos, who died in the 50s, I think, he would be considered kind of a contemporary exponent of this. Fidas, who's a living theologian here in Athens. Even Metropolitan Carlos Tosware, unfortunately, has to be put in this camp. And they're influenced, and they seem to agree with Vatican II ecclesiology on some points, on these key points. And there is a fuzziness, and there are really good theologians like Losky who create the impression that they're warming to Vatican II approach. So there's a fuzziness there among some theologians. I mean, the famous phrase that people use in Orthodoxy: "We know where the church is, but we can't be sure where it is not, and therefore we should not judge."
Yeah,
that goes back to Evdokimov, Paul Evdokimov, who who was actually present at the Second Vatican Council, and he is cited by Butler, a British Roman Catholic theologian and who was president of the Second Vatican Council. He cites him as influencing him and influencing the council in terms of this perception, this kind of agnostic ecclesiology that does pass into the Vatican II text. It's much. I think it's not even agnostic in Vatican II. It's very clear, but in the Orthodox, they're still reticent to make cataphatic statements in terms of the mysteries. But they do go that far, and that to me that seems very close to what Vatican II is doing in terms of going away from the Church is the Roman Catholic Church and stating, well, it subsists in. And what we're saying is, well, look, we know where the Church is. We're the Church. It's the one Holy Catholic Church, but we can't really say where it's not. Forgive me, but it's absurd. The statement itself is absurd, and it's a departure from our incarnational ecclesiology. We know where Christ is. We're living in Christ, and He is just as much present today in the earth as He was when He walked on this earth in flesh. In fact, He's more present. And I'll make this point, and I might shock some people, but people, the people who are part of the church post Pentecost are more intimately connected to Christ than the people who walked with Him and saw Him and heard Him speak, because we commune of the mysteries. We commune of the Eucharist, His body and blood. We are His temples of His Holy Spirit. That was not the case when He was on this earth. So He's more present post-incarnation than He was before. So the idea that we can say where He is, but we're not really sure where He's not, because that's what when you say we know where the Church is, but we can't really say where the Church is not. That's absurd. It means we don't know. We're not living Christ, and we don't have the criteria. But St. John says, "You have the charism. You know all things." The Spirit of God speaks and explains. So this is, I think, a similar dissolution of our ecclesiology that's happening in Orthodoxy, and influenced by Vatican II. That statement is not patristic. At the most, it goes back to and inspired by Ecumenical in the 19th century. None of the fathers ever spoke in this agnostic way about the Church. And if you do even think in this terms, then the canons of the Church don't make any sense, because the canons of the Church are based on the idea, or based on the fact that the Eucharist is, and participation in the Eucharist is the criterion of whether you're in the Church or not. I mean, the canons, the fact that in the canons they excommunicate people means that the Eucharist is where the boundaries of the Church are. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense. Why the canons lose their meaning? And being excommunicated would be meaningless, because if the schismatic can be excommunicated and then go and commune in the schismatic church in the same mysteries of the Church, and what's the point of the canon? I mean, it's absurd. The Church knows where it is, and the Church knows where it is not. And it knows itself, and it knows if that group there that's teaching the heterodox confession of faith is not the Orthodox Church, and so there are plenty of ways where you can see we're being affected by this ecumenical ecclesiology, and we have our own version of it. Of course, we're not just mimicking Vatican II, and we're not going to the degree anywhere near the degree of dissolution of Vatican II. But the fact that there are Orthodox theologians who talk about recognition of ecclesial character and ecclesial nature and this kind of talk is certainly, that's Vatican II, and that's the 20th century ecumenical movement. It's not the fathers of the Church.
In preparation for this, you sent me over the last, month or so, quite a few documents. And so there was Metropolitan Herodios, Metropolitan Athanasios, and some others, and I read those documents and letters, and the Church of Georgia. What is your assessment of the reaction to this upcoming synod? What do you expect? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, the major document that's at stake and that is being disputed and rejected by the authors you mentioned, Metropolitan Athanasius of Cyprus and Metropolitan Orthodox Vlachos of Greece and the Church of Georgia. That document is entitled "The Relations of the Orthodox Church with the Rest of the Christian World," and there are other issues with the council, the organization of the council, the way they're voting, who's invited. There's a lot of problems there, and the people have been critical of that as well. Bishops have refused to go from the Church of Greece because of these innovations in the organization of the council. So they apparently smell a rat there in terms of the organization. But I'm interested in the ecclesiology. That's what I study. That's what I'm writing on. And my interest is in this text. And I think that the problem is with this text, and it's influenced by the contemporary ecumenical ecclesiology. And I think that at this point, it's hard to say what's going to happen. There's still a lot that could happen between now and June. 18th, I think, is the beginning of the council. It's the day of Pentecost. They're going to be meeting in Crete. And they're going to be 25 bishops from each local church representing the local churches. And they're going to be considering these texts. Of course, these texts have been drafted by committees. And so this text is not representative of the Orthodox Church at this point. It's representative of the representatives that were sent to these committees. And most of them are ecumenistic-minded theologians and bishops. And so I really don't think the text is reflective of Orthodox bishops around the world. The question is, what the local churches are going to do with this text until June, and then at the council, how they're going to react to it. And so far, there's been a pretty sizable negative reaction, which we cited just a few examples. And it's focusing and centering on two or three things in the text. The first thing is that although there are very good Orthodox statements, clear statements that the Orthodox Church is the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and that it is the nature of the Church is unchangeable. Those are Orthodox statements, of course. The problem is that in the contemporary ecumenical context, as you and I have seen with Vatican II, at the same time that they stated that, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church is the concrete manifestation of the Church, et cetera, but, well, there are also other churches, less fully churches outside of that. So it's stating that alone in this context today, in the ecumenical movement and the ecumenical ecclesiology, does not mean that we are expressing an Orthodox ecclesiology, especially when, as is the case in the text, they reference and they make references to other churches. And they talk about the need for Christian unity. And they talk about the need for the Orthodox Church to work toward Christian unity. Well, in a dogmatic text of the Orthodox Church, that kind of language is inadmissible.
Right.
It's not possible for us to talk about other churches. We're using the term in this context. We're using the term in a dogmatic sense, and there's only one church, and we confess that one church. So you cannot refer to other churches in existence. You can say confessions or anything else, but not churches, because, and now people say, well, of course we always refer to them as churches. That's how they refer to themselves. Yes, that's true on a daily basis in the ecumenical movement. I understand that that's the case, but this is a dogmatic text, and it's a text that's supposedly going to come out of a Pan-Orthodox Council, and is going to be approved as an expression of our dogmatic consciousness. And so it's totally inadmissible. But that's the double talk of ecumenism. It's the double talk of Vatican II. It's the kind of language that is very common today and people are used to, but it's not the language of the ecumenical councils. So that's what people are objecting to, and that there's no reference to schismatics or heretics anywhere in there. And of course, anybody who's read the ecumenical council minutes and decisions, they're filled with references to schismatics and heretics. It's as if they don't exist today. And that's exactly the same vein as Vatican II. Vatican II didn't talk about schismatics or heretics. Everybody's a separated brethren. We're all pretty much in the church, more or less. That's not the vision of the Orthodox Church, and certainly not of the ancient Orthodox Church. So those areas are and you can read online the commentary by people like Metropolitan Athanasius of Lemessurion of Cyprus and everything, where he says, where essentially what I just said, he questions the whole approach of the text. Now, another aspect of the text, which is less obvious but really important, is what I said a bit earlier, how there's a indirect reference to the ancient canons and the interpretation of this reference. It's paragraph 20. The interpretation given by the contemporary ecumenist theologians is totally within the context of baptismal theology, of the common baptism theory. And so, although on the face of it doesn't appear to talk about baptismal theology or common baptism or anything, the interpretation being given it by representatives of this part of the ecumenical movement in Orthodoxy is definitely in step with that, and in step with Vatican II. And I think that what is possible is that they're going to then, if they can get this passed through the council, then post-council, they're going to say, look, the council, this is a Pan-Orthodox council, they've approved this, and this is what this means. This is what it means. It means baptismal theology, it means common baptism, it means ecclesial nature, we're recognizing. And it's disingenuous, it's deceitful if they turn around and they do that. Of course, they've already done it. I mean, the theologians have already said this is what we mean by it. But whether or not the Pan-Orthodox Council means that, that's another question. And I think there'll be a fight. If this text is not rejected beforehand, because there's a possibility the local churches won't even allow it to get there, but I think it will get there, and it'll be on the agenda in June, and there'll be a fight definitely there, as there were in all the ancient councils. This idea that the church is not filled with differences of opinions is nonsense. Has always been the case, and there'll be a fight there. If this text passes as is, and there's no changes made, which I think is difficult at this point because the Church of Georgia has rejected it, then we're in for a real adventure in the Orthodox Church, because there are plenty of people right here in Greece who will consider anyone, a council or a bishop or a local church who accepts this document as accepting a heretical view of the church.
Yeah.
And then, God help us.
Well,
what will happen?
I was just going to say my opinion, just from my research into the history of ecumenism and the various powers and forces behind it. I wouldn't expect it to go away anytime soon, because there's a lot of interest at stake in this, and that may not be the realm that you want to comment on or go into, but if you do have any thoughts on that, I'd be interested to.
Well, it's well known. It's well known that the political forces that be are using the churches for their own benefits. There's agendas. There's political agendas. I mean, that's all well known. Most of the faithful are clueless about that, but anybody who has read about the ecumenical movement of the 20th century knows very well that, behind the founding of World Council of Churches, there was the political establishment of America, and I mean, you can go on and on to the roots of it, and the people who are involved. Who were the people involved in the first great gathering in Edinburgh? I write about this in my book, the Missionary Origins of Modern Ecumenism. Mm-hmm. I mean, these are the same kind of people who are behind the formation of the League of Nations.
Exactly.
And then of course, and that's always been the case. It was the case in the ancient church. I mean, the emperors, the heretical emperors, were using the church and others. Anybody who thinks that's not happening is just naive. The question is, are the bishops going to allow the manipulation of the political powers passed? Mm-hmm. Are there enough bishops who understand what's at stake that are going to stand up and say, no, we're not going to allow this to pass in the Orthodox Church? That's what is still the question that will be answered in June. So we're all, praying and working hard that the faithful and all the bishops who are still considering this, the Church of Bulgaria on the 28th of March will be meeting. The bishops will be meeting to discuss this text. There's a lot of opposition in Bulgaria against this text. Mm-hmm. The church in Greece will be meeting after Pascha again to discuss this text. So it's still an open question how much influence these outside political forces have in the church, and whether they can get their will done. What they want essentially is any kind of borders to be done away with, emerging in every way possible. That's what they're interested in. They could care less about the language we use. Mm-hmm. They're not theologians. They're not interested in that. But they definitely want to see the end result. The image that is projected in June needs to be, hey, we're all but one big family. It's okay.
Exactly.
It's all. It doesn't really matter anymore if you're Orthodox or you're Catholic. We're all in this boat called ecumenical Christianity. That's the end game for the politicians.
Absolutely. Now, the book is the Ecclesiological Renovation of Vatican II, an Orthodox examination of Rome's ecumenical theology regarding baptism and the Church, and you can purchase that from uncutmountainpress.com, and of course I'll have links in the interview. I think we're coming near the end of this. Is there any other, do you have any sites that you write for regularly other than perhaps Ancient Faith, or is your stuff out there somewhere with...
Well, yeah, I'm just now about to launch a new website. It's called orthodoxethos.com, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks that'll be live. And that's where all my writing and commentary is going to be from now on. But up at this point, no, I haven't had a one site that I've been writing at.
Okay.
A lot of my work's been done in Greek, and like the conference I'm going to next week in Athens. So hopefully I'll be, now that I've got the book behind me and it's published and it's circulating, hopefully I'll be doing a lot more work in English, and you can look for that, orthodoxethos.com. It'll go live in a few weeks. And just plug in my name if you're interested in what else I've done. There's plenty of videos and talks and things online that people can download and check out. But the book is what I hope people will be interested in and take a look at it. And we can have more of these kind of discussions. It's been very beneficial, and I hope that when you finish the book, Jay, we can come back and discuss the second part of the book, which is the more deep theological analysis of Vatican II.
I think that'd be great, absolutely. And if you're listening, be sure and check out Father Peter Heers